phones off and stay seated during our speaker. Help me enthusiastically welcome our speaker, Elena.
All right. Here she is. Hi, guys. All right. I'm Elena. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is September 9th, 2023. I have a sponsor. I talked with that sponsor pretty much daily, as close to daily as I can get. I meet with her once a week. I have a home group. I have a commitment at that home group. It's Girly Birds, shout out. And I sponsor women in the program. I take them through the steps the way that my sponsor took me through the steps. Because that's what I know and that's what works for me. Welcome to the newcomers. Congratulations, Joe, on, what was it, 2 years? That's incredible. Yeah, I'm really nervous. And that's the truth. And I was told that as long as I don't lie up here, it'll all be okay and I won't burn in hell. So, what, I can't say that? Okay. So I'll tell you what it was like. This is so overwhelming. So what it was like, I was raised in Phoenix, Arizona. That's where I'm from. I was born into a dysfunctional family, and that's not why I drank. I want to make that very clear. Those are two separate things to me, because before all of the fluff of like dysfunction could even like hit my dainty little ears, I had this thing where like I always needed more. I have an inability to feel comfortable in my own skin. I have an utter inability to feel okay in general, unless I have something like divine intervention come in and help me. You know what I mean? But I was born in a dysfunctional family, and I was also raised with strong religious beliefs and values that were, taught to me by somebody else. So I had a conception of a God that was not my own from a very young age, and I believed in this because I was told from a very young age that if Elena did X, Y, and Z perfectly in the eyes of this specific God, then I would finally be okay. I would finally be comfortable. And now remember, my big issue is that I can't be comfortable. I can't be okay. There's this thing in me that feels the need to fix something, and I've lived with that my entire life. This feeling separates me from you. So you all look like you're having fun. I've heard that before, but it's true. When I heard it in here for the first time, I was like, you do all look like you're having fun. You do look like you're all okay with yourselves. You do all look like you don't have a problem with the way you walk and the way you talk and the way you act and all of those things. And I just do. And I don't know how to fix this, right? It felt like you were all born into this world with a pair of glasses that I just didn't get, with like some sort of handbook that I didn't understand. I didn't know how to read that language. I didn't speak it correctly. And I was also super sensitive. Everything you did made me feel two things, and I only knew these two emotions until I got into Alcoholics Anonymous. I only knew fear and I only knew anger. And I can hardly remember a time where I was truly happy. I'm sure I was happy because I did experience a lot of love growing up, but I don't remember it, and I think that speaks to alcoholism at large. And so I took my first drink. I was a late bloomer at 18 years old. I had decided that I couldn't stand to live in the dysfunction of my own family anymore, and I booked a plane ticket on a Tuesday night, and then by Thursday morning, I was living in Idaho. I was living in this lady's trailer. I had never met her before because this is the kind of planning that I do. And I'd never been to Idaho either, so that was awesome. I didn't have anything like a winter coat. I'd never left Phoenix as a kid. And so it was fun, honestly, until it wasn't. I booked that plane ticket. I got on there and I landed in that trailer, and that's where I discovered the margarita. I went to Margaritaville, you guys, And let me tell you, for the first time, I felt okay. I felt secure. I felt like I didn't need to walk any extra steps or push any miles to get the God of my childhood understanding to love me, because it didn't matter in that moment. And I remember too that I remember being able to breathe for the first time, but I also remember that I didn't want any of you to see me in that state. I wasn't the kind of drinker that liked to drink in public. And I learned this very quickly because I'm sort of what they call a binge drinker. If there's more alcohol in the room, I'm going to drink all of it. If I know that you can get me more alcohol and you're in the room, I'm going to manipulate you to get it for me, right? And some of those behaviors didn't stop just because I stopped drinking. But I digress. I remember one specific incident. I've shared this story before, but I think it really speaks to my own powerlessness over alcohol. This lady that I was living with, she let me move into the basement for the winter because, it was getting cold outside and the trailer heater system broke. And in her nice fancy fridge that she paid for with her job, she also had every kind of liquor that an alcoholic could want for, which was super awesome for me. And I remember that she had a toddler as well. And this toddler had no shortage of baby bottles. And I thought to myself, well, I don't want to be branded as a delinquent for drinking all of this, because again, there's more alcohol in the room, so I need to consume all of the alcohol in the room because I'm an alcoholic, and this is the only thing that makes me feel okay in my skin, and I still have to show up for work, and I still have to go to school, and I still have to do all of these things, right? But I don't want to be branded as a delinquent. So what I decided I was going to do was pour just a little bit of each kind of liquor into 7 baby bottles that her toddler had that she wouldn't notice had gone missing if I snuck them. And I placed these bottles in the room that I was living in downstairs in the basement in various places to hide it from myself. And I figured I'd get through one a day, right? And that's just enough to keep me in check. That's just enough to get me going, to help me to show up for work and school and all of these things that I still have to show up for. And I remember I did that at 4 o'clock, and by 7 I was blasted. I had blasted through the whole thing. And I had every intention of not drinking those things, you guys. Seriously, this was the first time I ever remember trying to moderate my drinking. The other story that comes to mind when I think about my own powerlessness is the one time I was able to control my drinking. I spent the entire night thinking about how I was going to, before I showed up to the event, I spent the entire morning thinking about how I was going to say no to the second drink. And then once I said no to the second drink, I spent the rest of the week thinking about how I could have drinking more. And that's the obsession, right? And so what I've just described to you is my inability to control and enjoy my drinking. And in More About Alcoholism, it talks about if you find you can't control and enjoy your alcoholism, you might probably be an alcoholic. But here's the thing, I didn't think I was an alcoholic when I got here. I went to my first meeting when I got sent to rehab for mental illness back in, I think it was shortly after I had left Idaho. And they made you go to AA meetings there. It was one of those treatment centers. And they were insistent that I was an alcoholic, that I had this disease, but I didn't look like you, and I didn't act like you. And my problem wasn't that I drank too much. My problem was that my dad was terrible to me. My problem was that, I have no money. My problem was that I come from a trailer. That's my problem. My problem is that I'm severely depressed and I have all of the things. And so they took me to my first AA meeting. I remember it was on the beach in California, because I went to one of those fancy rehabs. And somebody had called on me to share, and I ran away into the ocean crying because the meeting was on the beach. And so we're at a stark difference. Stark changes are happening in this moment. You guys, I should be running away right now, and I'm not. So there you go. But yeah, and after I finished up treatment there, I went to another treatment center that was dual diagnosis, and I talked a big game about how I wasn't an alcoholic, and I wasn't an alcoholic, but they also made me go to these AA meetings, right? And I sat in these chairs and I listened to you guys talking. I went to treatment here in Prescott, and I started to hear things that sounded a lot like what went on in my mind. The oversensitivity, I heard that here. I heard things about the insecurities. I heard things about your anger and your fear, things that I thought I had done a great job of keeping to myself, keeping quiet to make sure that none of you ever understood what was going on in my head. And you echoed the same thoughts, and I thought I was the only one. And so over time, I gradually became convinced that maybe I might have something similar to what was going on with you guys. But here's my other thing too, is like, I didn't drink for very long, and I'm really young too. And you're all like way too old, you know? Just kidding. Sorry, love you. No, but that was seriously an issue that I had, was that like, I'm just young, I'm going through a thing. You know what I mean? Like, I'll get over this very soon, you'll see. And then I'll be rich and famous. But that never happened. I spent the first 4 years that I lived here battling with myself and my sponsor about the truth of my own disease. I was unwilling to admit that I was an alcoholic like you guys, because no person likes to think they're bodily and mentally different than their fellows. I remember in one of the 4 of my dry years here, I would wake up every day and I would read that paragraph and more about alcoholism. And now I was convinced that I wasn't an alcoholic, but also like this specific paragraph in the big book struck a chord with me. And it's the part about like, the one that I just said, like no person likes to think that they're bodily and mentally different from their fellows. You know, we go to extreme lengths to prove this. And I can't think of anything more insane than that, honestly. I think that speaks to my powerlessness a little bit more than any of the drinking ever did, because like I'm sitting there telling you to your face that I'm not an alcoholic, but every day I'm going home and I'm reading more about alcoholism and sobbing, because deep down within me, I do know the truth, right? And it took me a while to get here. It took me 4 years to admit that to myself, and I know that I'm lucky for that, because some of us take a lot longer to get into these rooms, right? But eventually I learned that like my problem wasn't this mental illness thing, because if the mental illness thing was my problem, then the treatment for mental illness would have worked. One of my favorite speakers, Bob D, said that, and I've always resonated with that quite heavily. He says that like, if my problem were depression, the treatment for depression would have worked on me, but it didn't. And that's exactly my experience. I did therapy, I read the self-help book, I took the medication, and I was just as crazy as when I started. The only thing that has worked for me with real consistency has been working the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and practicing the principles that have been taught to me in those steps and in the traditions. And I love Alcoholics Anonymous. It's changed my life entirely. I'm a different person than what I came here being like, and thank God for that. And I hope that that trend never stops for me. But when I decided that it was finally time to concede to my innermost self that I was an alcoholic, there was some real work to be done. And I remember that the first thing, right, is the admission of powerlessness, but then there was the issue of unmanageability. And I couldn't see my own unmanageability from afar. And so, like, it had to be pointed out to me time and time again. I remember I was in the revolving door of AA for the 4 years, right? And so when I decided to get sober fully this time around, I didn't want to admit to you guys that I had relapsed again, because that's embarrassing, and I'd done it like I don't know how many times, and you were going to kick me out, and you were going to say that I wasn't an alcoholic and I didn't belong here and I was just young, and you were going to tell me that like these chairs were going to be better suited for somebody who actually wanted to get sober, and so I was afraid of you. And so I didn't really go to any meetings the first 3 months of my sobriety. I didn't tell my sponsor the first 3 months of this sobriety that I had gotten sober again. But I continued to show up to our meetings, and I continued to lie to her. And I remember my friend at the time had told me a little bit about this women's meeting that I knew nobody at, or I thought I knew nobody at. And she said it was at 7 in the morning, and I said, girl, you're crazy. But I was really desperate. I was really desperate, and I was really willing to do this thing and to get it right. I was tired of relapsing over and over and over again, and I knew at some point, especially after my last run, that if I continued to go the way that I was going, eventually I was going to drink myself to death, or worse, I was going to just take myself out of this world. I was at that jumping off point that talks about in the big book of I couldn't imagine my life with or without alcohol. I just couldn't imagine my life. I couldn't imagine the next day. So I was willing, I was desperate. So I got my butt up at 6 a.m. because I was living in PV, and the meeting is kind of a little bit closer to Prescott. And I drove myself to this meeting every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday morning. And at the same time, I was working at a bar downtown. And so I felt like for a while I was living in the real world and visiting AA. And I saw the results of that, right? The results were that like I wasn't getting a lot out of it, and I knew that like eventually I was going to drink again. So at about month 3, I decided to get honest, and I'd heard enough honesty in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous to know that I wasn't going to die if I decided to tell the truth. So I drove to my sponsor's house and I let her know, like, hey, by the way, I'm sober now. And all she asked me was if I was willing to do whatever it took. And I said yes, and I meant it this time for real. And so we commenced to work the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I had to take a good look at my unmanageability, the unmanageability of that entire scenario that I just described to you. I had to take a look at my powerlessness over alcohol, but over more than alcohol. I had to take a look at my powerlessness over money, over your reaction. I had to take a look at my powerlessness over relationships, the way that I treated men, the way that I treated women. I had to surrender all of it. Right? And then in step 2 came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. Well, the first step is knowing that I'm insane, and I do know that, but then the second step is, I don't know, me and God have always had like a kind of a rough history. I told you I was raised really religious, and that the God of my childhood understanding was a very black and white and unforgiving God. And so I had to admit that maybe, I had to get to a point where I could admit that maybe Elena wasn't the biggest power in the world, right? And at this point I'd been beaten down by my own alcoholism so bad that I was like, okay, fine, maybe there is a God. But then what I really struggled with in step 2 was like, okay, like let's say there is a God, who knows if he actually cares about me, Like I'm assuming God's pretty big and like cares about a lot of people. Who's to say that like one of the things on that godly agenda is Elena? And so that honestly still comes up for me sometimes. And where I've landed with that is that I see that he cares about you because you're sober and you seem to be living happy and useful lives. And you tell me you're nothing unique, you're nothing special, you're just another bozo on the bus. So if that's true for you, then maybe it could be true for me. And then step 3, made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand him. The understanding of God has changed and evolved with me in my sobriety and over time, and through rounds of sobriety, God has changed for me. And what's funny about the whole God thing, me and God have always had an issue, but I picked my sponsor specifically because I admired her relationship with her God. And so it's a little hypocritical for me to stand here and badmouth God when that's the very thing that drove me to this position that I'm in now. And in step 3, right, like I actually get to apply that to my own life. I get to use the principles that have been, I've been talking about with my sponsor for quite some time, that I've been reading about in the big book. It's the first kind of quasi-action that I get to take in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I decided to turn over one small thing, and I just waited to see what would happen as a result of that. The result that I got from turning over the first small thing, I don't remember what it was, but I do remember getting the gift of relief pretty quickly afterwards. I remember feeling relief. I remember feeling freedom. I remember not feeling the need to manage something, but I also remember feeling like I was being I was walking a tightrope and just trusting that I wasn't going to fall. I remember feeling like I had let go of the steering wheel and like God was magically just driving the car. I felt crazy is what I felt like, but a different kind of crazy than before, because it's super unnatural for an alcoholic like me to decide to go hands off and place something in the hands of something bigger than myself, especially if I don't entirely know what that thing is, right? But it worked, and I didn't drink. I continued to not drink, and I continued to actually get happier and feel a little bit more comfortable in my skin. And I started to do things at that point in my sobriety that were very uncharacteristic of me. I started to say hi to you. I started to call you and ask you how your day was. And I've never done that before. And then I commenced to work a fourth step, made a searching and fearless, what was it? Moral, fearless and moral inventory of myself, whatever, you can read it. And this is where I learned that all of like the big deals in Elena's life, like positive or negative big deals, are not that big of a deal. Because most of the time I had a huge role to play in my own suffering. Most of the time I manufactured my own suffering out of nothingness, right? And then I carried that suffering with me, and it drove my thoughts and my actions. And what I learned is that even in situations that were completely out of my control, right? Because I've had some dysfunction occur in my life, even in things that were completely out of my control, typically what I do with them is I hold on to them and I make them part of my identity. I make them part of my story so deeply that they now affect the way that I treat you. And they now affect the way that I operate and show up in this world. And it's useless. That's what that is, right? I'm trying to find retribution constantly for the things that have happened to me by mistreating you. And that's what I learned in step 4. By the time I finished writing my fourth step, I remember viscerally shaking, and I'd worked previous fourth steps before in previous sobrieties, and I'd never been this honest, and I'd never been this thorough, and I had never felt what I felt simply writing down, putting pen to paper, the things that I truly, honestly did, holding nothing back. So then we go into step 5, and now I have to share this with my sponsor, the woman who's watched me go in and out of the rooms for quite some time. And now, like, I'm under no delusion that she thinks that maybe I'm a redeemable character, because at this point I've done some questionable things. But it's still like, how do I say these things out loud, right? And how do I get honest? Because I've been lying about who I am for my entire life, but especially the past 4 years that I've been floating around the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been lying constantly about who I am. I've never told the truth in my life, honestly. And so that's the other action that I took. That's the next action that I took in Alcoholics Anonymous, where I saw some promises come true for me. You know, in step 5, it talks about in the big book, right, some of the promises are we can look the world in the eye. We're no longer ashamed of who we are. Like, a certain confidence flows into me, and I feel a power begin to flow, and suddenly I too begin to understand God. It says at the end of step 5, we thank God from the bottom of our hearts that we know him better. I know God better because, 1, I wrote down the honest truth about myself. I practiced some level of humility, and then I practiced some strength, and I practiced some honesty by sharing it with another alcoholic, right? And in that moment too, where I'm sharing these things, I'm getting to hear back for the first time ever that I'm able to hear it, that I'm not alone in a lot of those things. And that I'm not this terrible character that I've always thought that I was. And again, like, if she can experience some freedom around these same things that I've carried with me my entire life, maybe one day I can feel that too. So step 5 is where I first get to meet God, right? The God of my understanding. And I need that God, because then I go into step 6, right? We talk about character defects. I get to be on the lookout for character defects. And something amazing happened for me around this time in my sobriety too, is you know, right after I shared my fourth step with my sponsor, I started to notice my character defects, like really notice. Like every single day, you guys, like I'm noticing my own selfishness. I'm noticing my own dishonesty. I'm catching myself for the first time every single time I'm gossiping, and I'm feeling really gross about it. Usually I don't feel gross about my gossip, Usually I feel pretty good about it, right? Because because I feel better than you because I'm talking about something else, Because I'm talking about somebody else. I'm character assassinating. For the first time, I feel horrible about my lies. That's super strange for me. That's very uncharacteristic of me. And it felt like for about a week there that I was working this sixth step, that all I could see was the negative about myself. So thank God for good sponsorship, because I got to check in every single day about these things, and I got to be redirected back to solution, right? But usually by the time, and this has been true for even after working the first round of these steps for me, usually by the time I get to step 7, I am so sick and tired of myself because I've done the writing, right? I've done the writing on my character defects. I've done the talking, right? Step 5, I've talked about my dishonesty. Step 6, now I'm noticing how often I'm lying. By the time I get to step 7, I am sick and tired of myself, and I am willing to go to just about any length to kick the dishonesty, to kick the anger, any length necessary. And it's the same sort of bottom that I hit with alcohol, right? I have to get sick and tired of the same result over and over again, and I have to reach that point of desperation in order to do something differently, and that's just the kind of alcoholic I am. I have to experience the worst of it before I'm going to change. And so in step 7, what is it? I humbly asked him to remove my shortcomings. Now I have to pray to this God, right, that I'm still not so convinced cares about me and has any stock in my life whatsoever. And, I feel kind of lucky that he relieved me of the obsession to drink, because he has relieved the obsession to drink for me by this point. But now I'm now I have to bother that same God again with my dishonesty and with my gossip. Are we sure that's going to work, you guys? Are you sure there's not something else I can do about this? But remember, it said in the beginning that I was willing to go to any length, right, to get and stay sober. So I did. I started praying, and I got on my knees to pray for the first time in my life, which was super humbling, especially from somebody who was a self-proclaimed atheist when I first got here. And so the result that I saw from that is that I kept gossiping, and I kept being dishonest, and I kept, it felt like it wasn't working. And then one day, after rigorously praying every single day, multiple times a day over these character defects, I caught myself in the middle of a lie, and I experienced what they call a pause. And I had the ability for the first time in my life to not do the thing. And I ran right to my sponsor, and I was like, "You will never believe what just happened." And she was like, "Yeah, I told you," which is how most of our conversations go, to be quite honest. And so I saw that result, and I liked that result, so I kept doing that thing that was suggested to me. And then I got curious about what other things I could do, right? And one of the other suggestions that was really difficult for me to take was to get involved in the community of AA, because I knew what you guys were like, right? And none of you are doing AA in a proper way. I'm very judgmental. That's one of my biggest character defects, right? None of you are doing AA the way that I do AA, the way that works. And so I don't want anything that you guys have. And so I was pretty friendless for quite some time. And one of the suggestions that was given to me was to get involved in AA. And what I learned about you guys around this time in my sobriety from taking that suggestion is that you're not all that bad, and you don't hate me, and there's nothing to be afraid of. And, you all have things to offer, right? And also, I get to know my God better by getting to know you better, right? Because I can't hear the message if I'm not coming into the meeting, and if I'm not talking to you guys after the meeting, and if I'm not showing up early to engage with you guys. That's something big that I learned around this time in my sobriety, I remember too. Vulnerability has always been really difficult for me. And in those moments where I choose to get vulnerable about all these things that I'm working through, all of the character defects coming up and all of the impulses and urges and the reactions, the successes and failures, bonding with you people over that, I do feel like we've survived the same shipwreck as it talks about in the literature, right? And I begin to see that fellowship grow up about me. And tonight I get to see those people, sitting in the crowd tonight, and I get to feel the love in my heart for the fellowship that God has created about me, right? Because I wouldn't be sober without you guys either. So anyways, step 8. Made a list of all the people that I have harmed, and the list, honestly, this round of sobriety was a little bit shorter for me because I'd made a lot of amends in previous rounds of sobrieties, but there were a few that were really difficult to make. And the biggest ones were to my parents. And I remember, when I first got in here, I told you guys that they were the reason that I did drink, and I told you at the beginning of my share that they're not why I drink, and I didn't know that until the amends happened, right? And I didn't know that the way that I treated you people that aren't my family was so closely tied to the resentment that I was holding on with the people from my family. And so the freedom that I got to experience from making those amends was incredible, right? I started to show up differently in these rooms. I started to show up differently with you. I started to take a real interest in your personal lives. And that, coupled with practicing the vulnerability with you inside and outside of the meeting, I started to experience real connections. And the book talks about the fellowship as a substitute for that thing that we've always been looking for in alcohol, the thing that I've always been looking for in alcohol, right? And so I get that incredible gift out of step 9. And I get other incredible gifts too, I don't regret my past or wish to shut the door on it, and I start to understand too for the first time that these experiences make me useful to you because now I care about you. And now I'm interested in helping you, right? And I never planned on that. I never planned on being interested in caring about you. For most of my life, how I felt about you guys is pretty much indifferent, horrible, or I was obsessed with you because you had something that I wanted, right? Now I start to see you as real human beings. Now I want to show up for you. And I learned that these experiences that I have to make amends about, right? The things that I have to do real work on make me actually useful to you. And then, in step 10, continue to take personal inventory. And that speaks a lot to the kind of program that I work today. I have to keep honest with my sponsor today because in previous rounds with this sponsor, I usually around this point in my sobriety, I have 18 months right now. Around 18 months last go around, I stopped calling my sponsor as often and I stopped telling her things, right? I stopped getting honest with the people, the women in my friend groups. I stopped telling them the truth, which was that I still feel insane. And there are moments that I wake up insane. And today I have to actively choose to do something differently because I know what it does for me to be lukewarm in this program because I've lived it for the past 4 years, right? I know what dishonesty does for me. I know what withholding information does for me. I know what not working a program does for Elena, and it's not pretty. The result is me being 1.5 years sober, going to the bar for some vicarious pleasure, and being a loose woman, okay? There are insane things that I still can participate in when I don't have a thing in my system. And that's because that's just always who I've been. And so I need this thing, right? And in step 10, I get to be accountable for the program that I'm working. I get to be accountable to myself. I get to be accountable to my God and to you guys. And then in step 11, I get to continue to seek God. And my grant sponsor says that it's in the seeking that we find God. It's not in the finding that we find God, which, is an important distinction for me because I always think that I'm waiting to arrive. I always think that I'm waiting to arrive at the moment where everything clicks into place and I know who God is and I know how he works and it all makes sense to me. And there's also a point that I arrive in AA where I'm 100% happy 100% of the time. And thank God that you all remind me that those things aren't true. Thank God I get called out for that sort of perfectionistic thinking because I drive myself insane that way, right? And in step 11, I get to remain curious. When I first got sober again this round, I I heard a phrase in a meeting like this one about the kind of recovered individual I wanted to be. The speaker shared something about being a student of recovery. And as a young girl, I was a very studious young woman. I did really well in school. So I knew what it meant to study. I knew what it meant to sit down with something intentionally and read it like my life depended on it, and take notes and look for that thing outside of the studying, right? And I learned early on that I have to apply that same logic and that same thinking to the 12 steps, to the big book. I need to be in the literature constantly. I need to continue to be a student of recovery. Because if I don't, I will convince myself that I know everything here, and I don't need to show up to the meeting, and I don't need to say yes to Chris when he asks me to speak at Rarely, you know? And then, it's a hop, skip, and a jump back to where I was a couple years ago, right? Miserable, dry, and honestly, I would have been kinder to you if I had had a drink at that point. So in step 11, I get to be reminded to stay curious, to stay being a student of recovery. And then in step 12, right, practice these principles in all my affairs, and continue to look for the newcomer as well. It says in the literature that 12-step work is the bright spot of our lives, and that has been 100% true for me. It hasn't come without its own emotional difficulties, but I know for a fact it has kept me sober. The past couple of months, I've walked through some pretty difficult things. I've had a family tragedy strike. I've had personal tragedies. I've had things that were outside of my control occur within the past couple of months. And let me tell you, nothing feels better than having a sponsee call me up and tell me about their lame, lazy day, because it's like I get to be reminded of the sort of disease that I have and the solution that I've found here. And then I get to be of service. I get to make my pain and my experience useful, right? And there's something about that interaction, right? This whole program is based in the idea of, at least for me, the way that I understand this program, right? It's based in the idea of one alcoholic talking to another. Me talking to another alcoholic has never failed me, right? And I've been able to walk through insane tragedies that way. And I've been able to accept great success that way as well. Accepting success is incredibly difficult as well in recovery, right? And staying connected to the alcoholic, keeping my hand reached out 100% of the time, has always worked for me. Just before the meeting started, my sponsee texted me, right? And I got to be available. And I was super nervous. I'm still super nervous. I feel like I said everything wrong tonight, right? But for a moment there, before this meeting started, I got the opportunity to be present for another alcoholic. And that brings me right back to my body. That brings me right back to the present moment. That brings me right back to what I'm doing here and the purpose of this whole thing, right? And I hope that I've told the truth tonight, and I hope that you've heard the truth tonight. I hope you've heard something that resonates with you, because like this program has changed my life, like I said before already, and I'm so grateful that I kept coming back. That's the other thing I want to say, is even throughout all of the uncertainty, and all of the mistakes that I made in, me not being able to concede to my innermost self that I was a real alcoholic and that I needed to be here and that I needed to be working these steps, right? The one thing that I'm glad I did, the one thing I did right by myself in those 4 years was that I kept showing up to these meetings. I kept showing up to my sponsor's house. I kept opening the big book. Even when, that was the last thing I wanted to do and I didn't want to be here, I kept coming back. And I think that's for a reason, and I thank God every day for that. And my perspective has shifted immensely, because where I used to believe that I was robbed of the experience of being young, wild, and free, right, drinking out and about like all other 22-year-olds do, today I look at it differently. Today I look at it as I was spared the last 10 or 15 years of drinking, right? Today I look at it as some people aren't lucky enough to be in the position that I'm in now. Some people die before they get to make it to this point. And, instead of looking at it as something to curse God about, I get to be grateful to God for this. And my connection to my higher power is the most important relationship that I have today. And so it's important for me to stay in that gratitude and remind myself of all of those things. So anyways, I'm going to stop talking. Thank you.